History as it happens, December 9th, 2021. The tyranny of the minority.
We must find a way to pass voting rights whether we get rid of the filibuster or not.
These talking points are an effort to use the terrible history of racism to justify a partisan power grab.
This is going to be a fraud like you've never seen.
It's a rigged election. It's the only way we're going to lose.
Democracy is built on majority rule with protection for minority rights. But what happens if the side that's unable to win a majority of votes in an election or for a piece of legislation uses the system to achieve power anyway? That would be a tyranny of the minority. And that possibility and occasional reality dates to the founding of the Republic. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing.
I mean, basically, these guys are like Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks used to say, I think Lenin said this at some point, that capitalism will hang itself by its own noose, that its own rules are going to undo it, and we're going to be the beneficiaries of that. Well, that's kind of what's going on here.
All right, you ready? The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in 1798. The nullification crisis of 1832, the secession crisis of 1860-61, the overthrow of Reconstruction in the 1870s, and filibusters to block civil rights legislation in the 20th century. What do those chapters from the American past have to do with what many see as an assault on democracy, on majoritarian rule today? Well, why don't we ask a historian?
Any democratic system is vulnerable. Let's start from the beginning with that. Democracy is a fine thing, but it has many, many vulnerabilities.
Sean Wilentz is back on the podcast to talk about this tension, this idea that electoral majorities are susceptible to tyranny. So therefore, if you really don't want to, say, comply with federal law or accept the validity of an election, you can nullify it or secede or claim ad nauseum the election was rigged.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
We're going to talk about the notion of minority rule, or as Wilentz puts it in his latest essay in the journal Liberties, the tyranny of the minority. Take the nullification crisis of 1832. John C. Calhoun invents the idea that if a state does not want to comply with a tariff passed by a congressional majority under its constitutional power, then the state can just nullify it. Today, critics of the Trump-ruled Republican Party, and Sean Wilentz is one of those critics, say the GOP is using a combination of gerrymandering, voter suppression laws, and state-level moves to seize power over voting and election oversight. The Republican Party is using these methods to cement minority rule because, the argument goes, they otherwise would not be able to win control of Congress or the White House, or at least not without great difficulty. At a recent hearing on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, Democratic Senator Dick Durbin explained why minority rule is a real possibility.
Legislators throughout the country have introduced more than 425 bills with provisions to make it harder for people, particularly people of color, to vote. 19 states have gone on to enact 33 of these laws.
So for this and other reasons, many observers say democracy is being undermined in our country, out in the open, incrementally, through legal, if not entirely legitimate means. You know, last year before the presidential election, I read a bunch of books about the end of the Weimar Republic. It seemed relevant to our problems. A democracy buffeted by hostile forces on the left and right, with the far right prevailing in the end and turning a democracy into an authoritarian police state. And we know what happens after that. Now, I know bringing up the Weimar Republic, it's got you thinking that I've lost my mind. So let me say loud and clear, I am not comparing Republicans to Nazis or anything like that. But I really didn't have to read German history to learn what the death of democracy looks like. I could have looked at my own country's past, at the overthrow of Reconstruction, the American South's experiment with multiracial democracy subverted, white supremacy reimposed, and by 1900 or so, Jim Crow rules. So the point of citing these episodes is not to bring you back to college history class. It is not to say they're identical or that history is going to repeat itself exactly. That's not what we do here. The point is, these chapters from our past have something in common, something we can learn from: the tyranny of the minority. Princeton Sean Wilentz is one of the finest historians and public intellectuals in the country. He is the author of The Rise of American Democracy, as well as No Property in Man, among several superb books. Sean Wilentz, welcome back, my friend.
Great to be here, Barton.
Your fourth appearance on the podcast. How about that?
Oh, my God. Is that a record? I guess it is. Maybe it is. I hope it is.
I think you're leading the league. I'm not sure.
Okay, very good.
I think last time we spoke, I said if you keep this up, you would be first in line for the History as It Happens, tote bags, and coffee mugs. But,
very good.
With the supply chain problems, they're still stuck on a boat. Stuck on a boat in the Indian Ocean. So
Right.
The first person I thought of when you mentioned your new essay, Tyranny of the Minority, was John C. Calhoun. Of course, his name is in the title, but before I saw the full title. It's a funny thing about democracies built on majority rule. Of course, that is the definition of democracy. A radical unified minority, say a voting bloc in Congress such as the Tea Party, can dictate outcomes, provided the rest of the math works out, right? A voting bloc can hold the balance of votes needed to pass legislation or not pass it. The fire-eating secessionists were at first a radical minority in the South, but they would carry events. You discuss a lot of different forms of minority rule in your essay, but let's start with this notion that democracies built on majority rule are susceptible to damage from radical minorities.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, any democratic system is vulnerable. Let's start from the beginning with that. Democracy is a fine thing, but it has many, many vulnerabilities. There's the vulnerability of majority tyranny, something that the framers were very concerned about, that minorities will be persecuted, be undone, because if the majority rules, then who's going to stick up for that minority? So you have to have a system that's going to guard against that. But by the same token, you can have a majoritarian system, which is undone by minorities. So this is always this tension. And sometimes the tension can be owned. We have a Bill of Rights, for example, to help prevent tyranny of the majority. But sometimes it breaks down, and I think it's breaking down now.
A lot of that Calhoun died in 1850, so he did not live long enough to become a secessionist, but the fire eaters were his inheritors. One reason why you're one of my favorite scholars, Sean, is you've always helped me consider familiar subjects in a new light. And you did it again with this essay. You explain why there's always been this tension in America, as you alluded in your first response, or maybe this apprehension about too much democracy. This does go back to our founding, yes? Madison, the Federalists, the anti-federalists. So why don't we start with the beginning and work our way towards the present?
Sure. Well, I mean, at the founding, with the framing of the Constitution, and even inside the convention in Philadelphia, but certainly in the ratification conventions, the rise of the anti-federalists, there was this fear that a minority of the people was taking charge, that the small group of barely elected officials was trying to take over the government, that was going to be able to rule the roost from this new centralized post, that with the scrapping of the Orders of Confederation, that too much power was going to be invested in too few people. And that was essentially the anti-federalist position, and that the Constitution, they thought, was designed precisely to be able to do that. Madison argued against that vociferously in Federalist 10, in Federalist 45, in Federalist 54, arguing against it, showing that the checks and balances will be there. In a large republic, interests will balance themselves out. So he tried to design a system in which majority tyranny would be minimized. It would always be there, but it was going to be minimized. And then the Bill of Rights, of course, helps do that later on. Funnily enough, once the Constitution is ratified, people who have been behind it, particularly James Madison, suddenly begin to fear a tyranny of a minority. They're not becoming anti-federalists, but they're fearing this. And what do they fear? Well, they feel that the Federalists have concentrated too much power, that they're overrunning the power of the states, of the individual states. They're particularly angry about the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, the Sedition Act, which basically tried to eliminate as much as possible political opposition. So they're worried. They're worried that this minority of people is somehow taking control. They try to find some way to go about checking that minority, that Federalist minority, which they thought was not representative of the American people at large. Now, today we might go to the Supreme Court, come up with a challenge of the Supreme Court to the Sedition Act, let us say. But it didn't work that way in the 1790s. It was not altogether clear what the review power of the Supreme Court was. That was only going to be worked out in part in Marbury v. Madison in 1803. So they couldn't go to the courts. It was an emergency, they thought. Americans were actually on the verge of civil war in some places. So they looked to the states, and they drafted what were called the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And in doing so, announced a whole theory of the Constitution, which was later going to become a vehicle for minority rights. But they saw it in a very particular way. I mean, one should not confuse what was going to happen later with what happened in 1798. They issued the Kentucky and the Virginia resolutions. And in Jefferson's draft, actually, of the Kentucky resolutions, he has an unfortunate phrase where he talks about how individual states can nullify federal laws. That gets taken out by a friend of his before it actually gets approved by the Kentucky legislature. But the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions come up with this compact theory of the Constitution, which states basically the Constitution's made up of the various states. There's no we the people that is overriding everything. There is simply the compact of the states, and that states' rights have to be respected. They are the constituents, in effect. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, they get nowhere. In fact, several legislatures object to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So instead of that method of going about it, Jefferson and Madison adopt a majoritarian strategy, which is what? To run Jefferson for president in 1800. And they proceed to show that, in fact, the majority is opposed to what the minority, the Federalists, were imposing by electing Jefferson president and sweeping through Congress then. So majority rule is restored, right?
Yeah.
But some of the ideas that came out in the 1790s are going to be picked up later on to justify a kind of tyrannical minority.
The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, as you say, they have been used and abused ever since by states' writers and who don't entirely misinterpret it, but they misinterpret them nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, look.
Because you can find what you want in there to...
You can find, yes, look, you can take Jefferson, and thank goodness somebody stepped on Jefferson's use of the word nullification, because that would have been, well, they pick it up anyway. But sure, out of that emergency, the emergency of 1798, what Jefferson at the time called the reign of witches, he really truly thought that a monocratic minority was going to be undoing what he had thought of as the American Revolution. The product of that emergency situation gets picked up later on to justify very different kinds of things.
Yes.
In particular, to justify not only Southern sectionalism, but to justify the slaveholders' regime in the South, to make it impregnable from any kind of interference by any anti-slavery agitation in the North. They pick up on that, first and foremost, by John C. Calhoun, the guy you mentioned at the beginning.
I want to get to Calhoun now, staying with this theme of there's always been this tension in our democracy about majority rule, minority rule. Calhoun and the nullifiers of the early 1830s. This was a prelude to civil war, if I would borrow a title of a William W. Freeling work. Calhoun believes states have a right to nullify, in this case, the tariff. Where did he come up with this theory of nullification? And did it have lasting influence? I guess it did.
John C. Calhoun is endlessly fascinating because he's often thought of as one of the great political theorists in American history. And I think he's about as great a political theorist as Roger Taney is a judicial theorist. That is to say, he makes up a lot as he goes along. And he has an object in view. He's very clear about that. But he will use whatever he can to try to get to that object. And the object that he is moved to in 1828, in particular, is that of Southern sectionalism, and to make sure that Southern states' rights are being protected against what he thinks of as a potentially dangerous national majority. There's a lot of background to that. First of all, Calhoun had begun as a nationalist. He'd begun as a supporter of high tariffs, along with Henry Clay, a man involved in expanding federal role in the economy, for example, to get that kind of aid to make America grow, as it were. But he switches. He switches his position in the 1820s. It becomes less and less popular inside of South Carolina in particular. There's a man named William Smith, who's his great antagonist. And they are much more dubious of this nationalist thinking because in the back of their minds is always the idea that the Constitution did not provide enough protection to slaveholders, to slavery. And there might come a day when the federal government would find some way to attack slavery. That is in the back of a lot of slaveholders' minds, and you can see that in their correspondence and their speeches and so forth. And so in 1828, by the time that now Calhoun has switched and he's been reelected as vice president, and he's vice president to the incoming President Jackson, there is a tariff that gets passed by the Congress in 1828, which has very high duties for various manufactured goods. Like all tariffs, it was a sausage that was being made to satisfy this particular interest in, merino wool producers in this little part of New York State, and to try and, match them up with various constituencies to make it better for them in the presidential election that fall. So they put together this tariff. It's called the Tariff of Abominations. It's hated so much by the South, which the South then seizes upon, Southerners then seize upon, particularly South Carolinians, as an example of majority tyranny, that they are now going to have to pay much higher duties than they can afford for goods that they have to import into the South while they have no protection for their goods, the export of cotton, buying in a protected market and selling in an unprotected market is basically what they're saying. The tariff, therefore, has to be objected to. And in fact, the tariff was not such a big deal, but they say it's a big deal. In 1828, Calhoun anonymously comes up with this protest, as he puts it, sketching out the theory of how a state can go about nullifying a national law, a federal law. And
there's no basis for this in the Constitution, though.
There's no basis for this in the Constitution whatsoever, particularly on the tariff. The Constitution is quite clear that the Congress has the power to enact a tariff. Now, Calhoun claims that the Constitution meant to only involve a tariff that was going to pay for the government itself. In other words, a protective tariff, he said, was not covered by the Constitution, that was a kind of Hamiltonian expansion of what the Constitution actually says, and that therefore the Tariff of Abominations was unconstitutional. This is basically hogwash, and it was made up as an attempt, though, by Calhoun himself to shore up his support in South Carolina, to advance his own presidential ambitions, which were great. He was going to now be the great behind-the-scenes protector of all of this stuff. Andrew Jackson gets elected in 1828. John C. Calhoun is actually his vice president, but Jackson and Calhoun have very different ideas about the Constitution and about the nation. Jackson, although a slaveholder, certainly is also a nationalist. And he believes in those areas in which the Constitution grants Congress clear national authority, that authority, which is governed by the national majority who elect the Congress, one way or another, it's individual districts and so forth, but it's an expression of the national will. That is what national elections are for. That therefore, if you're talking about an issue like the tariff, in which the Congress, that is to say the national majority, has power, there's no way that you can undo that. The only way to undo that is to elect a new Congress. And then you can undo it that way. It can only be undone with democracy. He sees this as a fundamentally anti-democratic effort to undo the national majority. That's Jackson's nationalism. Calhoun, however, for his own reasons, is a sectionalist, becoming a sectionalist, a pro-Southern advocate. And so he comes up with this idea of nullification. So he goes from being a nationalist to being a nullification or nullifier, as you put it.
That's right. Who wants minority rule? Because that's instead of electing more people to the Congress, you can't do that. So you rule by minority.
Well, within the context of the National Accord, he would say that he was, in fact, standing up for popular sovereignty within the state of South Carolina.
Or the nation of South Carolina.
Yeah, the Republic of South Carolina. It's always South Carolina, right, Martin? There's a great South Carolina unionist writing a little bit later on, not that much later than what we're talking about, early 1830s, named James Pettigrew, who once said of the state of South Carolina that it was too small to be a republic on its own, but too large to be an insane asylum. And I have to say to my friends in South Carolina, of whom I have many, nothing personal. But nevertheless, yes, it's always South Carolina because of the character of South Carolina politics and the character of the slave system in South Carolina. Is a reason for why South Carolina is always at the vanguard of these, as they would be in 1860 with secession. But the counter is what Calhoun is doing. And so Calhoun's ideas get picked up in South Carolina, his own state. And after another tariff is passed in 1832, which the South Carolinians find objectionable, they actually start implementing what was in Calhoun's exposition and protest of 1828. And they have a special convention, and they declare the tariff null and void within the state of South Carolina. Now, Jackson stands up to this. He will have none of it. He threatens to send troops. Eventually, a compromise is worked out, but only when the theory of nullification is repudiated. And Calhoun, by the way, in the midst of this crisis, is coming of a moderate. I mean, he thinks these hotheads are getting a little bit out of hand here. We're going to have to solve something. We're going to have to work something out. He does do an address, a famous address, the Fort Hill Address, in which he endorses this idea. But nevertheless, politically, he's kind of caught in the switches. And he helps work out, in the end, the compromise of 1832, which, actually gives the South Carolinians a lot, but over a much longer period of time. But the idea of nullification has been repudiated. Jackson gets through Congress a thing called the Force Bill, which basically says that. And Jackson's proclamation, by the way, in 1832, is a proclamation about nullification, is a very important document in American history. It is a ringing repudiation of the tyranny of the minority. It is a ringing endorsement of national politics. It's a ringing endorsement of nationalism in American politics, what the Constitution was essentially set up to do, which was to expand the general welfare and to provide the means to do that, which the Articles of Confederation could not do. I urge your listeners, if they have the chance, they can get it on the internet, to read through Jackson's nullification proclamation, which is the antidote to this kind of minoritarian thinking that we're talking about.
And I would also recommend The Rise of American Democracy by one Sean Wilentz, because you go into this whole issue.
Well, I'm not going to put Martin, thank you so much.
I'll be your book agent.
Yes, no, you're very generous. Yeah. It's not up there in importance, I think, with Jackson's nullification proclamation, but it does discuss the proclamation. Yeah. So
the implication here is, if nullification stands, well, then you have anarchy. Any state can pick whichever federal law it wants to follow. You don't have a union. You don't have a nation. You don't have majority rule.
That's exactly what Jackson says. I mean, Jackson says the Constitution established a government, not a league of separate states or a compact. But he uses the word league, which I kind of like, because it reminds people of baseball. But never mind. That is a government, and that the people exist under the Constitution as we the people, not as representatives of their various states. The state governments are not their representatives in national government. Rather, they are the people. And Jackson makes this very, very clear. And you can see, in fact, in the nullification controversy, actually, the seeds of the battle that's going to continue all through American history, down through secession, down through the imposition of Jim Crow, down through segregationists in the 1950s, down to today. You can see in that battle the essential constitutional distinctions that are being drawn.
So in a way, Calhoun's ideas did have some lasting influence. And he's also an answer to a great American trivia question. Name the only two vice presidents to quit. Calhoun and Spiro Agnew.
I mean, he quits because he has this fight with Jackson over nullification. I mean, that's the reason.
Yeah, they did not like each other.
No.
A key parallel in your essay in the journal Liberties is between the secessionists of 1860 and the current Trump-ruled Republican Party. Mm-hmm. Both declare they would not accept the outcome of an election, which is another way of saying we no longer accept democratic government majority rule. Sure. So we just did leapfrog over the Civil War there. Well, no, we're talking about it.
We're just getting there.
So how is Trumpism a form of minority rule that's similar to or different than what the secessionists did?
Okay, that's a good question. There are elements of minority tyranny in both. They're not the same by any means, but there are certain similarities which bear looking at, right? You mentioned one. In 1860, the southern states declared that they would never allow Abraham Lincoln to be inaugurated president, that blood would flow in the streets of Washington before Abraham Lincoln was allowed to be made president of the United States. What we saw on January 6, 2021 in particular, but throughout the campaign leading into that, was that from the very beginning that the Trumpists were not going to settle for Donald Trump not being reelected. They were not going to settle for a Biden presidency, that a Biden presidency would be, by its very nature, illegitimate. Now, there's a difference between the two. The slaveholders, the secessionists in 1860, they didn't come up with the big lie about there being a rigged election. They accepted the fact that Lincoln was elected. They weren't going to go and change election boards on that account. They weren't going to harass the governor or the Secretary of State of New York to overturn his results. No, they decided, all right, the election's been made. He's in office. We're out of here. We're going to secede. That's obviously not what the Trump people did. It's very, very different. I mean, they actually did go to try to browbeat people into doing it, and it culminates in the events of January 6th. But in a sense, I think, and this is what I argue in my essay, in a sense, what the Trump people have done is to initiate a virtual secession. That is to say that they believe that American government is so rigged, is so corrupt, that really the Trump people owe no real allegiance to that government, certainly not to the administration of Joe Biden. That it is illegitimate from top to bottom. And so we're going to withdraw our interest in all of that. We have no real allegiance to that. We'll obey the law. We're not going to do anything crazy. But in some deep, deep sense, what they have said to themselves is that it's time to withdraw our affection for the American government in quite the way that we had it before, that the administration is illegitimate, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure that this illegitimate government is undone. Now, and that's very different from real secession. It's not geographical, but it has some similarity.
They're building, too, on this idea on the far right that's been gaining steam for decades now, that the U.S. government is the enemy.
That's right. You can see this as early as the 90s, right, with the rise of the militia movement. You remember that at the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 was a manifestation of that, but it never really went away, that kind of idea that we need our guns because we have to take up arms against the government itself. That has spread enormously under Trump. That was very present on January 6th. I mean, there are some out there who want to start secession movements. I've heard in Texas there are active secession calls. You hear this, Dixie will rise again, things like that. I don't take them all that seriously. In fact, you have them on the left as well, as you always had secessionism on the left. Sometimes Californians say, we want to get out of here and establish the People's Republic of California. But it's particularly on the fringes on the right. But it's a different kind of secession than we're usually, when we talk about it in 1860, 61, it's something very different. But spiritually, it has some of the same thing, which is that these people are not really Americans. We are the Americans. We owe them no allegiance. We are going to do our best to get rid of them, and we will get rid of them, and then we'll come back into power. That is what they're talking about. It's
been my view for some time now that we're not going to have another civil war like we did in 1860. That's not to say we won't see violence. We did on January 6th, but a form of de facto secession where state governors and legislatures simply refuse to follow federal laws, and what happens next, I'm not sure. And I also believe Americans are just seceding from each other. We're in, not you and I, Sean Wilentz, but many people are in their own bubbles, and they don't want to interact with the, quote, other side. The bonds of our republic are fraying. You say in your essay, the events of January 6th, and this overlaps a little bit with my last question, so forgive me. The events of January 6th and all that led up to them were also in some ways a far more profound assault on American democracy than the slaveholder secession. You go on to write, it was a direct attack by the Trump Republican Party on the national democratic process that even the Confederates did not attempt.
I mean, in 2020, Trump was talking all along, unimaginable for there to be a legitimate Biden presidency. If he wasn't going to breathe on Biden during one of the debates in order to give him COVID, which I take to be a kind of as close to an assassination attempt as anything I've ever heard of, but be that as it may, all along he was saying that. People did not take him seriously. People didn't really take him seriously. But some of us did take him seriously and could see what direction he was going. And he was going to go in the direction of doing what he could to undo the results, because the results were bound to be close in some places. That's just the way the elections have gone. And so we were very clear that as soon as the last vote was counted, if Trump didn't win, there would be lawyers in various places, Pennsylvania, Florida, all of the battleground states, doing their best to overturn the results. And that's exactly what happened, except it happened on a scale, none of us had quite predicted. But it became very, very clear that that's what he was doing. And he was giving the big lie that the election had been stolen and that there was this thing and that thing and it was all bogus. Yeah. But nevertheless, that's what happened. Now, that's a different kind of assault on democracy than seceding. This is actually perverting the very system of democracy, as opposed to saying we're going to form our own democracy. And by the way, the slaveholders were not big Democrats either. I mean, small d Democrats. Obviously, they're built on slavery, number one, but even in terms of the processes, they were rather, shall we say, shady, to say the least. Even in getting secession, in fact, I'm convinced that in many of the states, it was manipulated in order to get secession. The fire eaters played dirty. But apart from all of that, it's a different kind of proposition to say that you're leaving the country, we're going to start our own republic, between that and perverting from within. I mean, basically, these guys are like Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks used to say, I think Lenin said this at some point, that capitalism will hang itself by its own noose, that its own rules are going to undo it. And we're going to be the beneficiaries of that. Well, that's kind of what's going on here, is that democracy is being undone by its own laws, by its own rules. Rules that were set up in one way to try to guarantee a fair majoritarian democracy are being perverted. It's not only that. The structure of the Senate, for example, gives much more weight to Trump Republicans than they have in terms of majority rule, in terms of numbers. The less democratic of the two branches of Congress is the Senate. And that's something that's not being perverted by the Trump people, but all of the other stuff is. There's the voter suppression.
And we'll get to that.
Gerrymandering, which is sort of normal, but I mean, everybody gerrymanders. But it used to be that people elected their representatives. Now representatives actually, elect their people, the people who are going to be their constituents. Especially upsetting or especially dangerous are the attempts to redo the authority of overseeing elections in various states. That's what's scary. Now, would it come to the possibility, as was raised in 2020, that a state legislature will, by fiat, overthrow the results of an election and award the electors from that state to the opposing candidate?
Based on bogus allegations of fraud or something? Or
whatever. Yeah. I mean, it could even be as brazen as saying, we don't like it. Now, that would be astonishing, but it's possible. Look, my article is very dark.
Yeah, I was going to get to that. Let me ask you about that.
Okay.
A note about Steve Bannon, too. I believe he compared himself once to Lenin. He called himself, a Leninist who wants to blow up the system. Your essay does end on a dark note, not only because of gerrymandering, voter suppression, some of the other modern-day tactics, but also the fact that they can lead to a permanent minority. In other words, you can't undo these tactics.
It could very well do that through gerrymandering in part. But if these other shifts in terms of how elections are overseen, he who oversees an election very often can call the tune of what the election is going to be. They figured that out. And by the way, the state legislatures themselves are gerrymandered. So it's not just the congressional districts. The whole system is being rearranged in such a way as to make it almost impossible for Democrats to get a majority. Now, I'm not saying that Democrats should always have a majority, but I'm saying that is not democracy. It ceases to be democracy. And if you line up what's going on, people are sort of saying this. I mean, kind of watching this happen in real time, but with very little outcry. Think tanks have been talking about it, I've heard here and there. But we're watching what could be the destruction of American democracy before our very eyes, right? Now, the fact is it's being done legally. Whether it's legitimate or not is another matter. But it's certainly being done legally. So it's very difficult for the Democrats to speak up, but it's still happening. We have to talk about it.
I read a number of books about the end of the Weimar Republic last year, and allow me to preface this by saying I am not comparing the United States in 2020, 2021 to Germany in 1933. But my point is, Adolf Hitler and his beer hall push, he realized that after trying to violently topple the government in Bavaria, he had to use legal, although not necessarily legitimate, means to reach power. The January 6th riot was terrible, but was not going to result in any concrete gains, right? So we are seeing changes in states among the personnel who are in charge of elections being completely politicized.
Correct. Well, you're mentioning the Weimar Republic, actually, Martin, gets me thinking, because it comes back to the point I was trying to make at the start, which is that democracies are highly vulnerable. I mean, we may think of them as sturdy institutions. What a democracy is can be changed. The idea that you have things called illiberal democracy, like Orbán in Hungary, I mean, this is crazy, but democracies remain vulnerable. Weimar was more vulnerable than most. The United States has been remarkably, sturdy over the years. However, there was the Southern secession in 1860-61. There's no guarantee that American democracy can't be perverted. There's no money-back guarantee in 1787. If things don't work out, you'll get your money back. That's not going to happen. And so there are these places where democracy's means can be used towards corrupt ends. And this is what I'm trying to warn people about, really, in this article.
And I believe what you're getting at is we're not going to stop having elections at all levels of governments. We're not going to turn into some type of dictatorship, essentially be a non-functioning democracy. I mean, we're already dysfunctional to a great degree. Just watch what's going on in Congress and elsewhere.
I mean, you'll end up with a tyranny of the minority if you don't watch out. Look, it's not inevitable, and there are certainly constitutional ways to go about fixing it. And the idea of jettisoning the Constitution, no, I don't think that's a very good idea either, frankly, although some people will say that. But I do think it's possible to do it. But before we figure out how, we better be aware of what's going on. Lincoln was very aware of what was going on in 1860. The Republican Party was very aware of what was going on in 1860. I wish that Americans of goodwill would be aware of what's going on now.
And if I get any angry calls saying I was comparing Republicans or anyone to the Nazis, I'll just forward them to you.
Thank you so much. You're so generous.
Because I wasn't. You have to preface those types of questions.
I know.
Because it's an analogy that's worth exploring. But yeah, we're not saying anyone's a Nazi today. I mean, there are neo-Nazis. I think some of them actually were at the January 6th riot, but yeah.
Absolutely. But,
Yeah.
All right.
Well, on that uplifting note, Sean Wilentz, we thank you once more for returning to the podcast. Check out his essay in the latest issue of Liberties. And a final word about Weimar and why we should study it. As Sean said, it's an example of how a democracy's internal enemies can exploit its vulnerabilities to end it. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to have some fun. We're going to rank the presidents.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
In fact, our next 2 episodes, Jeffrey Engel and Jeremy Surrey will join us to go over the good, the bad, the terrible in presidential history. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.